just to elaborate on that final point about it being a diversion for tyrants to use against the political establishment at large, I think it is also worth pointing out some more mechanics of this, because essentially the only political contribution that anyone is allowed to make, there's a kind of orthodoxy now, that if you're not making a contribution that is in line with identity politics, in that you are correcting the identity politics disequilibrium, which is the only problem with the system, that becomes this kind of orthodoxy which is enforced. If you try to do anything in politics that isn't doing that, you're not doing the right thing, and you should be attacked for that, because you're delaying the advent of the radical utopianist project or some such bullshit. So there's this kind of latent insulation that is set up that just basically inhibits everything but a fascist political agenda. So the only people that can navigate these waters are fascists, and fascists can use it to effectively degrade anyone who is not playing the same game. So they can force people effectively to pander to them. And that obviously is very dangerous, because then everything just becomes a kind of, how much infantilism are you willing to dispense? In this kind of paternalist pissing game of how much infantilism are you going to give to the right deserving identities, and like that means sorting out the bad guys. So how much are you willing to discipline the bad guys and infantilize the good guys who deserve it, because they've been victims? And because that is the only paradigm which can be politically addressed, essentially it just makes it bigger. It doesn't, it just feeds more energy into that, and you don't end up ever doing anything constructive, because you have to pander to that kind of emotional logic and that kind of hysterical, mass hysteria over social justice. So you can't be rational. You can't take practical things into concern, because all those practical things will be marks of privilege, which is something that we have to destroy to bring balance to the identities. And so you get all these conflations because you've got this, let's say, perfect and complete moral narrative, and you can just force everyone to play their role in that narrative. And if anyone deviates from playing their role in that narrative, from wearing their brand of their identity and representing it, and taking on the appropriate amount of either compensation or shame, and they're not willing to make that the conduit for improving things, that's really the worst conflation here, is that is the only path to make things better. And the truth is that it doesn't make things better at all, not even the slightest. The only thing that makes it better is that particular ideological paradigm. Internally within the social justice movement, they can say, we're winning, they feel bad, or we're winning, we have this kind of racialist sense of opportunism and whatever, and it's fake self-esteem. It's this kind of collective, my identity is being showered some kind of just desert from the system at large, meaning that there has to be a system at large that is represented by some kind of demagogue or authoritarian. There has to be some kind of moral exemplar that is willing to take responsibility for the collective, for the entire system. So you can only have a Führer take on that role. You can only have a strong, authoritarian leader, essentially. And there are people who take this ideology, let's say, very sophisticatedly and abstractly, and they can kind of break it down to try to always keep it in some kind of liberal framework. Although I would say at some point, usually they just give up on that entirely, and they will vilify liberalism as being the conduit for letting bad things happen in terms of this ideological zero-sum game. But the whatever model of kind of address that this is supposed to take, usually it never reaches the practical implementation phase, because if you try to put any of these values, let's just call them, in practice, because they're always in the form of moral redistributing on the basis of some kind of moral absolute, which means that they are essentially all retributivistic. It's just some or other form of retributivism. That is what they are promoting, retributivism. And there is no creation in retributivism. The only claim that it can make is that it is just. And it is just to what end, or justice for justice sake. And at the same time, when they don't actually make the world better in any way, in fact, they end up making a worse situation, then justice means that you're not doing it strictly enough, you're not doing it tyrannically enough, you're not being radical and violent enough. And so this is generally why you end up getting a lot of fire around fascism and fascists. This is why there were so many fires in the Weimar Republic, as it was turning into Nazi Germany. This is why the Reichstag was burnt down to facilitate the coup as well. So you end up destabilizing just general liberal values like the rule of law, and just open democracy, and any kind of I'm not going to get into the legal positivism stuff, but it breeds a Napoleonic mentality, essentially. That the executive is this kind of moral arbiter. That sort of ends up being, well, it ends up creating a judiciary which is completely subordinate, which is antithetical, at least, to the South African system, in which the judiciary is actually the highest sphere of government. I mean, obviously, its ability to create frameworks. It doesn't really have the ability to create frameworks, but it does have the ability effectively to create laws, and trump the other branches when it does so. Okay, I don't want to get into these tangents too much. But I was just focusing on how some people with this ideology don't have any political vision attached to it, but they do have quite a stark vision over how it will mediate interpersonal relations, which usually is it's quite a deluded vision of some kind of pervasive mind control. And in fact, something that I said in the last recording, in that the ideology only operates and measures progress by countering specifically privilege, you could say as well, or the evil identity. And so the only way that it operates on an interpersonal level even is if you know, let's say, the everyone's relative scale of privilege versus you have to calibrate everyone's particular justice barometer in terms of how much injustice have they received, or are they carrying, or something like that. And so you have to actually be able to read people's almost their identity politics karma, which is itself an incredibly dehumanizing thing. There's this hypocritical racism that's right at the core of all. I mean, it can't escape us because it is essentially culturally and racially essentialist in nature. That's what the social justice framework uses, is that like people are their identities. They don't have control over their identities, essentially. They're handed them by history, and they can have some limited choices as a subset of that. It really is incredibly debilitating as an ethos. And this is why usually people who are on this wavelength or on this ideology, they cannot conduct their lives in a way that isn't reactive. They have to react to other people's aggression, because that is the only way in which they can get in touch with and channel that identity that they are, because they are defined by that justice barometer in terms of how much they have suffered at the hands of privilege, or the privilege disequilibrium in terms of their level of operation. That is how they define themselves, through that negative value system. And negative, I mean, because it is a gauge of disempowerment. And they can only gauge empowerment in terms of how much damage have they inflicted on the particular privilege which has diminished their power. So they become very vicious. They essentially become fascistic dogs. And this is why I have often, I understand this is insulting, but I mean, metaphorically it is perfectly accurate, that you get the sort of like the feminists who are like I don't know if I want to go through all the metaphorical distinctions, because usually when I bring up dogs, I bring up my other category as well, which has to do with the Napoleonic influence, but or the ideological system of the kind of Napoleonic admiration of the executive, but that usually is much more on the political side, where in terms of the actual, you could call it a social side or psychosocial side, you get quite vicious, sort of these kind of commanders of their group, and they want people to be afraid of their pack. They want people to respect the power of their kind of dog mentality, and if they don't have that as an interface to other people, essentially they have nothing. They have no compass. They have no way of measuring any kind of progress and meaning in the world. So because when you become a dog, you stop being a human. You don't actually have the ability to actualize meaning apart from some kind of shared solipsism within the essentialism that you're trying to break ground for and expand the empire of. And it's very interesting because they obviously talk about patriarchy, and essentially they're saying we have been the victims of an empire, so that is their justification for creating a counter empire. There's so much counter ideological privilege, which is their vehicle of salvation in this very false religion of essentially a racialist and or in the terms of the identity politics of feminism, sexist. It's a disgustingly sexist schema to adopt. You can't help look at people, and you're forced to define them in order to know what's happening. And so, I mean, this is why it is prone to some level of cannibalism. That it doesn't work unless you have a kind of clan rally with all the same type of feminist or all the same type of intersectional whatever. and they are just as convoluted in their kind of teachings as the Grand Dragon KKK members. They are just as disgustingly pseudo-intellectual, and they whip people up into the same thing. I mean, this is why the KKK had all those weird mystical titles. I mean, and which are now the roles that are being played by these gender studies feminist professors. That they fulfill the exact same moral aggrandizers of this ideological project. They are mini marshals in this identity. All because people don't want the burden of non-racialism, because people don't want the burden of just having to, you don't understand something, like you have to perhaps reach out, or you have to see if a connection can be made. You have to see if you can create a connection or negotiate a connection. No, you don't have to. You never have to do the work of creating or negotiating anything. It should all be done for you through your identity. It should already exist. So you've got this sort of always this kind of complacent demanding of that that complaining is the interface to reality, instead of any kind of accountability and responsibility for one's action. And so this is how the fascist gets in. I mean, the fascist demagogue cuts in because I'll do it for you. I'll make society safe for you. I'll make it safe for your identity. You don't. I will fix all the problems. We don't have to do anything. The time for us we don't have to do anything that anybody else says. They need to do what we say. And all we need to do is complain, and I will take the complaint and I will fix it. That is what the fascist formula is that you don't have to get your hands dirty in life. You don't have to question if you're wrong or right. That you can essentially set up an epistemological truth that belongs in your group, and because you don't have to substantiate it to anyone in any other group, and you don't have to threaten it with it ever adapting or changing or updating itself, because it already is true, and you never have to substantiate it to somebody outside your group, because that would be incredibly offensive for them to challenge you and for them to think that their question would need to be answered. You can set up this kind of separate but equal relativistic matrix, and therefore you can get the feeling of being self-righteous and correct, and you don't have to do the work of checking up if there are actually people out there who have a valid counter to what it is that you're thinking. You don't have to go out seeking for the truth. You don't have to worry about humility. No, you can use self-righteousness as an antidote to humility. You don't ever have to worry about self-criticism. Self-criticism never has to touch you. You never have to doubt yourself again. That is what is offered by this identity politics fascistic bullshit. And it's too easy for people. It gives them too much, and it gives them a defense against anyone, and they can even feel good at defending themselves from people who would question them. It gives you the tools of feeling more sophisticated than anyone. Because all you have to announce is that you're not standing up for the underprivileged in the situation. So that's your complaint, is no, you don't have a right to speak because you're not trying to solve the problem of the underprivileged people. And you better not be trying to sell them privilege. No, the problem is yours. You have to go and destroy your privilege. That is the problem. And when you go back and do that, then you might have a seat at the table. And then you can talk about things. But whatever you talk about, it better not be anything that sounds like privilege, because that is not the solution. So it's just this kind of table-thumped, privilege is not the solution, therefore we get to feel self-righteous forever. And if anyone sort of, tries to wriggle around too much, then you can just say, well, fascism is coming and you're on the wrong side. And if you don't fall in with the dog pack mentality, I'm going to enjoy helping you, into the, whatever gulag system it might be, or reprogramming, or who knows what will happen. But I mean, before it gets there, it's going to be it always is a kind of attrition. You can see it as waves. It comes and it goes, it ebbs and it flows. It goes between calling for radical violence and justifying radical violence, and then it just goes on about, we look at all the shame that this identity has had to bear. Let's count up all the shame. Surely something should be done about this identity shame. This person should not be carrying shame for their identity. This identity needs justice. And that is not the same question as we need to improve the situation for people living in reality. Helping an identity and helping someone on the ground in reality is not the same thing. When you give justice to an identity, you're building up racialist pride that really has no analog to any kind of transformative act apart from pumping up this ideological zero-sum game of revenge. Right. I had an exchange with a social justice person. I want to try and include that somewhere as a written record, because I think I give a pretty good practical breakdown as to why the ideology isn't capable, and in fact why it invariably will always generate massive corruption and massive mismanagement, why it is wholly incapable of promoting authentic transformation. So I hope to include that as well.